Hello, welcome or welcome back to my channel. My name is Grace. It is lovely to have you here. I have been looking in more detail at my TBR recently because it has gotten to a point where it's not fun anymore. It is just kind of stressing me out and my flat is full of books. And there are some books in particular on my physical TBR that I find intimidating for whatever reason. A lot of the time it's because they're quite big, but it could be because I have super high expectations for them, or I think they're going to be quite complicated for my teeny little brain. There are many different reasons, but these are all books that I am really excited for, and I want to put out there into the world that these are on my physical TBR and they must be read at one point or another, no matter how scary that might be. And if there are any on this list that you think I would love or you've loved yourself, then please let me know, and hopefully that will motivate me to pick them up a little bit sooner. So without further ado, let's get into the most intimidating books on my TBR. First off, we have A Darker Shade of Magic by V.E. Schwab. I still have not read a V.E. Schwab book. Embarrassing, I know, but this was on my 24 books I wanted to read in 2024 list. Again, embarrassing. I still haven't gotten to it. I think I am scared of the amount of love this series has. This is a fantasy trilogy, although I think another book came out recently. I don't know if that continues the series or it's like a new series in the same world, but this tells the story of a magician who has the power to travel between parallel versions of London, and I've never known much more about it than that. I just know quite a few people who love this series. It seems to have a proper fan club behind it, which I think makes me nervous because I really hate when a book has so much love and such a community around it and I end up not liking it, and that's what I'm scared could happen. I've also heard a couple of things about the female lead in these stories and how she might not be the most complex character. I've heard a few people call her a little bit of a pick-me, which sounds questionable, but I want to give these books a try for myself and make my own conclusions on them. I think the magic system sounds really fun. I love the idea of traveling between these different versions of London, some of which have magic and some don't. And from what I've heard of V. Schwab's writing, I really just need to give it a go. My boyfriend is also desperate for me to read The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, which I think is quite different in writing style to this series, but I know that he loved it, so that's got to be a good sign, right? Then we have one that I picked up on a whim several years ago now. This has been on my TBR for some time, and this is Threadneedle by Carrie Thomas. This is described as a coming-of-age fantasy novel about a girl who has always been taught that magic is dangerous, and she's been counting down the days until her magic will be bound so she can't use it and it can't hurt her. But one day she bumps into some strangers who show her, yet again, a magical version of London, and the wonders of this new version of the city begin to make her question all that she's been taught about magic before. This is intimidating to me for two reasons. One, that it is quite long. It's about 550 pages, which, to be fair for a fantasy book, is not necessarily that long, but as a slow reader, if I'm going to commit to a book that is over 500 pages, then that is a good chunk of my time. And that is something that I really want to do more often. I want to try to put less pressure on myself to read lots and lots of books and allow myself to really savor some really big chunky fantasies or just longer books in general. But it's still a hefty investment, especially for a book that I have not really heard anyone talking about. Like I said, I picked this one up on a whim in a bookstore years ago just because I thought it sounded interesting and I liked the cover, but I don't know if I've ever really heard anyone talk about it, which sometimes can be fun. I do really like finding a hidden gem that I haven't heard talked about before, but it also makes me wonder if there's a reason I haven't heard about it, you know? But I'm hoping I'm just overthinking that. I mean, this one's reviewed by Robin Hobb, so how bad can it be, really? Now, saying that, another book on this list is Royal Assassin by Robin Hobb. I have only read Assassin's Apprentice, the first book in Robin Hobb's Realm of the Elderlings universe, and I enjoyed it. I read it several years ago now for my dissertation, actually, at university, because I was writing the beginning of a fantasy novel for my dissertation, and it took me a little while to get into, but I did end up really enjoying it. And clearly I enjoyed it enough to buy the second book in the series, but not enough to dive straight into it. And this is another one where this series is so beloved. It has such a community around it that I find that a little bit scary, because I want to be part of that, you know? I want to be able to join in with this love for a series, and I'm nervous that I won't feel the same way. If you don't know all of the Robin Hobb lore, then this is the Farseer trilogy. This is book 2, and that is the first series within the whole world of the Realm of the Elderlings. There are several series within the kind of overarching series. And the Farseer trilogy tells the story of Fitz, who is an illegitimate child of royalty in this fantasy setting. So he gets brought into the royal society and their keep, but not as an heir or a prince. He is given a different job entirely and ends up training to become a royal assassin. Honestly, I think I might enjoy the first book more now than I did back in, I think it was 2020. So I would like to reread it, which is another element. I need to reread the first book before continuing this one because it's been so long. But this is very much one of those stories that just follows someone throughout their life as they grow up, which I personally really love. I love a character study within a fantasy setting. I love fantasy books that aren't entirely focused on the action, even though there is action and fantasy adventure in here. We are really following this character. And I also love political intrigue, which is obviously a big part of Fitz's story. I think I'm also a little bit scared because I know how sprawling this world is, and there are several series within this series, like I said, so it feels like quite an investment to get myself emotionally attached to this series, but I think it will probably really pay off for me, so I think I just need to bite the bullet on this one. As you can tell, a lot of these are fantasy books just because a lot of the biggest, chunkiest books tend to be fantasy, but just to mix things up a bit, we also have The Book of Form and Emptiness by Ruth Ezeki. This one I'm nervous about because I don't read that much literary fiction. I would like to read more, but it is definitely a little bit out of my comfort zone. And this one has the audacity to be over 500 pages and not even a fantasy book. So it is both chunky and out of my comfort zone, but I picked this one up again several years ago now because I thought the premise sounded really interesting, and I read the first couple of pages and thought the writing style sounded really like my kind of thing. This does have a little bit of magical realism to it, which I think will help. This is the story of a 13-year-old boy whose father passed away a year ago, and he is starting to hear voices of the things in his house, inanimate objects. And this slowly spreads into the rest of his life until he ends up finding refuge in a library where at least the things know to be polite and whisper. This book sounds weird, which I tend to really enjoy, if it's done well at least. I would really like to branch out into other genres a little bit more, especially bridging the gap with some magical realism. I think that would really help. And I think often the writing style that I personally crave can be found more often in literary fiction than in fantasy. I like weird experimental writing that is sometimes a little bit pretentious. I just also like magic, but I have a feeling that this one might give me both of those things. Next up, we have Earthsea by Ursula K. Le Guin. I have never read anything by Ursula K. Le Guin, which is kind of wild at this point, especially as someone who has always wanted to write fantasy. Ursula K. Le Guin is such a staple of both the fantasy and sci-fi genres, and this is actually one that I picked up to read while I was working on my dissertation and then just didn't get around to, but I think that it would be really beneficial to me. And I also know that she's just so well loved, which is again kind of what scares me. I have no idea what Ursula K. Le Guin's writing style is like, and I can be quite fussy with my feelings on writing styles, so I'm nervous to give her writing a try in case it doesn't work for me. But from everything I've heard about her as a person and the way that she uses fantasy and dystopian and all of these different aspects of speculative writing to present real-world issues, I feel like a lot of my values align with hers, and I really think it would be interesting to read about those within a fantasy setting. As far as I can tell, this sounds like a pretty classic fantasy adventure. This tells the story of Ged, who is a goat herd on a fictional island, and he discovers one day that he has magical nature-related powers, and he ends up being shipped off to this magic school. Classic. And interestingly, I don't hear as much said about Earthsea on the internet as I do a lot of other works by Ursula K. Le Guin. I think some of her sci-fi novellas have been a lot more talked about in recent years, maybe because those explore relevant themes to where we are in our societies today. And I am interested in reading those too, but this has been on my shelves for so long now, and I am, at my core, a fantasy reader and writer. Hopefully. So I think that this would be a useful and important read for me in both of those senses. Then we have another brick. This one is Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke. This one is 846 pages long. I've mentioned a few times now that I really want to get to this one. I think I put it on my reading list for this year. I've heard so many great things about this book, and I also really enjoyed Piranesi by the same author. That book was experimental in ways that really itched my brain, and I know that a lot of people love the atmosphere in this book. This is set in an alternate version of England back in the Napoleonic Wars, where magic is known to exist, but it seems like all of the magicians have died out until two new ones appear on the scene. First we have Mr. Norrell, and he begins to show off his magical prowess to society, including summoning ghost ships to fight back the French. But then Jonathan Strange appears, who is the diametric opposite to Mr. Norrell. He is young and daring, where Mr. Norrell is much more cautious, and the two of them end up in a magical battle that may end up being bigger even than the one between England and France. Again, you can see that a lot of my reasons for being intimidated by a book often boil down to it being either very long or very well regarded, and this one has both of those things. I am scared that I will spend an incredibly long time reading a book that will not live up to my high expectations of it. I think with this one as well, I'm a little unsure how I want to go about reading this one. I don't know if it's better to properly set aside some time, maybe try and read this in a 24-hour reading vlog or something, and just focus, try to get through it quite quickly so I can be properly immersed, or if this is the kind of book that's better to savor, to read over the course of several weeks, maybe. If you've read this one, I would love your opinion on if this is the kind of book to devour or to linger on. I am very excited for this one. I think it probably will follow through on a lot of my expectations. I'm just nervous as well. Now, you may have thought that that would be the longest book on this list, but you would be incorrect. That title goes to The Wise Man's Fear by Patrick Rothfuss. I read The Name of the Wind, the first book in this series, again several years ago now. I think it was 2019, and I loved it at the time. Do I think that was a perfect book? No, and I will go into that in a minute, but the writing style is gorgeous, and I just had a really fun time reading it, even though it was pretty hefty. Now, this second book is even longer than the first one. This is nearly 1,000 pages, which would be the longest book I had ever read. And the reasons I'm nervous for this one are manifold. This is a fantasy series about Kvothe, I believe is how you say his name, who has a very storied past. We begin the story with him as an innkeeper, but he is telling his history to us. And this is very much one of those series where you just follow his entire life from his humble beginnings through to all of the great adventures that he goes on. He has so many legendary stories about him in the world, and in this series you find out how many of those are true. And Patrick Rothfuss's writing is so gorgeous and lyrical. I found that first book much easier to get through than I expected for how long it was. I did think it had some issues. There were not many female characters in that first book, and the one prominent female character that we did have was basically a walking stereotype, and that's just from me reading it in 2019 when my critical thinking skills were not what they are now. So I do have some qualms about finishing the series in that regard, but I think that I can push through those, except for the fact that this series is not finished yet. This second book in the series came out in 2011, and we're still waiting for the third one. I'll let you do the math. We've had several different novellas come out in recent years that fill in some gaps in the series. I haven't read those yet either, because I think you're meant to read this one first. But the third book, we still don't have that much news of. I think it has a title, but no release date at all. And I'm scared that if I pick this series up again and get emotionally invested in this world once more, then I might never get a conclusion to this narrative. I've kind of been waiting around since 2019, hoping that we would get more news of the third book, and then I would pick this one up, but still here we are in 2025 with No more news. So this is the one on this list that I actually do have the most issues with, I would say. I think this is the most justified of my intimidating books. Then we have probably the book on this list that I most just need to suck it up and get to, and that is The Spear Cuts Through Water by Simon Jimenez. I've mentioned this book several times because I think I'm going to love it, but that always scares me. This is a fantasy story set in a land where a tyrannical emperor and his sons, who have terrifying magical powers inherited from the god locked under their palace, are terrorizing their people, but then the god breaks free with the help of a guard and an outcast. And the three of them end up on a journey to escape and to save the realm from this tyranny. I have just heard so many good things about this book. I've heard so many interesting things about the writing style and the experiments that this one takes. From what I've heard, it's told in several different formats from different interesting perspectives, and everything I've heard has just made me think more and more that I am going to love this one. But I think for that reason I've been putting it off. This feels like the kind of book that I need to do justice as a reader. I need to be in a place mentally, in a reading mood, where I can appreciate this one as much as it deserves. I really want to be able to appreciate the intricacies of the artwork in here, the writing decisions that have been made. I think that this could be quite an inspiring read for me, again, as someone who wants to write. So I just keep putting it off because I never feel like I'm in the right mood to do this one justice, but I'm just gonna have to suck it up and read it one of these days. And I think that I put this on my reading list for 2025, so it's gonna have to be a day in the nearish future at least. Then for a little break from the fantasy again, we have Entangled Life by Merlin Sheldrake. This, again, I think is on my list for 2025. I try not to watch them back because I want to be surprised at the end of the year by how well I did, or not well. But this is a non-fiction book, which I don't read that often, and I struggle with non-fiction. My attention span is not what it used to be. But if you've watched my videos before, you will know that I really like mushrooms. I think they're very, very cool. I love nature in general, and I want to get more into nature writing. But I think strangely enough, from the experiments I've had with reading nonfiction, the scientific side of things might be more interesting to me than the kind of lyrical writing focused side of nature nonfiction. And this definitely is that. I know a few people who've read this one and have really enjoyed it, and it is quite science forward, I think, which I think I'm going to really enjoy, but it also scares me because science was never my thing in school. Looking back, I wish that I had tried a bit harder in science because the natural world is definitely one of my passions today, and part of me wonders if maybe I could have gone into a field to do with conservation if I'd chosen different paths in school. But I would at least like to, in my free time, learn a lot more about the natural world, and mushrooms are an area that I find especially interesting. And I also just love being able to tell people fun facts. I love being on a walk and being able to point out what a plant is or a mushroom is or a bird is. I went on a mushroom foray last autumn. I actually made a video partly about it where we got to learn all of these different kinds of mushrooms from these experts who pointed them all out to us, and I just thought it was so, so cool. So it's an area of interest for me that I really want to foster and develop more, but I'm still unsure if reading books is the best way for me to learn about factual things. So this one sounds really interesting to me, but in actuality, we'll see how this format works for me, I guess. But I'm excited to give it a go. And then last, but certainly not least, especially in size, we have A Day, a Fuller Night by Samantha Shannon. This one is about 860 pages, not including all of the glossaries and maps and things, but I shouldn't be as intimidated by this one as I am, because I have read Priory of the Orange Tree and I really enjoyed it. I don't think it was perfect. I think it had a couple of pacing issues for me, and I don't know if the ending was quite as fulfilling as I wanted it to be, but I did find it really easy to read. I had a lot of fun with that book. It took me quite some time just because when I read it I wasn't reading as often as I am now, and it did take maybe about 100 or so pages for me to get my head around the world and all of these new names and terms. But after that it was much faster and much easier going than I had expected for a book so big. And I've even heard from a lot of people that they prefer this one, which is a prequel to that book. If you don't know, The Prior of the Orange Tree is a sprawling fantasy epic set in a world with dragons and political intrigue. And this is the prequel set many, many generations before the events of Priory. I'm a little bit nervous because the events of this book you kind of already know, because it is a prequel from them being the mythology that is the basis of the world within Priory. But there is of course a difference between reading a story as mythology and reading it as it happens. I think I just am incapable of being not intimidated by a book that is this chunky. Again, this is one that I wonder if it would be better for me to read in a shorter span of time, because I read Priory over the course of about 2 months, and I think I might have enjoyed it a little bit more if I'd done it, maybe not quite in one go, but over a shorter period of time. And I do read a lot more now than I did then, so hopefully I would be able to get through this one a little bit faster. But it is, again, just a lot of time to set aside for one book, and that is definitely something I want to do more often, but I need to get my head around that. I'm sure that once I've started this one, it will feel easy again and much less intimidating, just like Priory did when I properly got into it. It's just getting past that first layer of, wow, this is nearly a 900-page book. So those are my most intimidating books. I do really like the sound of all of these, and they're on my TBR for a reason. I have a feeling that I will enjoy them all. I'm not certain, but I hope. I definitely want to get out of the mindset that as someone on BookTube I need to read a certain number of books in a year, and I want to be able to read the chunky books without guilt, even though that means I maybe have fewer books to talk about in a month, because otherwise I'm missing out on all of these great epic stories. And there really is something about losing yourself in a tome. You get to properly immerse yourself in that world, and I haven't done that in a little while now, so I would like to get back in the habit of doing so. Are there any on this list that you think I should get to sooner rather than later? I would love your opinions. And what is a book that you find intimidating on your TBR? What have you been putting off, even though you think you probably are going to really enjoy it? Thank you for listening to my nervous ramblings, and please bully me in the comments to get to these soon. I hope you are having the loveliest day, and I will see you in another video very soon. Bye-bye.